One of the clones started to feel something was wrong and got into position. And then, out of nowhere, the creature threw part of itself at them. It was like the fish was baiting them in. Before anyone could react, the clone got hit by the fish and, as luck would have it, had its right upper limb torn off in the process. John felt the exact same pain in his arm, which was still completely intact. He was utterly confused. What was happening? Why was he in so much pain? He crawled into a corner, clutching his arm as the intense pain flooded him. He quickly realized the connection between him and his clone had been severed, but there was no time to dwell on that now. He quickly contacted Mr. Genmo and asked him where clone number 3 was. At the sewage treatment plant in Incheon, the agent responded. Without missing a beat, John told him to get clones 1 and 2 there right away.
Please to channel my Sakrapara. Sakrapara.
Something was very wrong. Meanwhile, Clone 3 was having his own problems, face to face with the giant fish man monster. And boy, was he on the defensive. This was the first time he'd had to deal with something this monstrous. The fish man was staring him down, and Clone 3 had no idea how to even begin fighting it. Back at the sewage treatment plant, John finally arrived, though he didn't quite expect to find a giant monster in such a peaceful place. His anxiety about being disconnected from Clone 3 only worsened. He checked his status and saw he still had a while before his familiar ability was ready again. He arrived and was promptly asked for his identification bracelet. To his relief, Mr. Genmo had already arrived before him with clones 1 and 2 in tow. John quickly briefed him on the situation, explaining that Clone 3 had disappeared and they were dealing with a serious monster situation. Mr. Genmo looked alarmed when he heard about the monster. "We should alert the authorities and close the area. That is a fishman," he said, his voice serious. "Even a group of class hunters wouldn't be enough to handle it." John nodded in agreement, but he couldn't just sit there and wait. He had to do something. Trusting his clones, he activated his familiar ability and sent direct instructions to clones 1 and 2, who were heading to find Clone 3. Their first task was to get to the spot where Clone 3 had disappeared. As they moved, one of them signaled to stay calm and wait for any movement. From a distance, they spotted a creature they couldn't quite identify. They quickly realized that they'd found the fishman monster they'd been warned about. How lucky! Now they could strike first. The stats of the fishman were on the level of an E-class hunter, but the clones only received 53% of those stats, so it wasn't going to be an easy fight. Still, they figured with their abilities, they had a shot. John instructed them to aim for the head. But when they shot, nothing happened. No damage was done, and both clones were left scratching their heads. John was just as confused as they were. Why weren't the bullets working? The situation was growing more complicated by the second, and now they had to figure out what the next move was. The fishman leapt towards the clones, looking ready to unleash an attack. The clones quickly dodged to one side, and the fishman landed between them with a loud thud. All at once, they attacked, but it only made a small scratch. John was watching and quickly realized, well, that didn't work. The monster retaliated, swinging again. But it missed the clones. John, trying to stay optimistic, praised them, saying, "Nice job." But honestly, in a tight forest like this, swinging a sword's pretty tricky. Then the fishman did the unthinkable. He sliced through 2 trees with a single swing. John, wide-eyed, muttered, "Forget what I just said." The trees came crashing down, and the fishman turned around, searching for the clones. Seizing the opportunity, they attacked again. This time, they managed to hit his arm, but it didn't seem to affect him at all. John sighed and said, "Okay, this isn't working. Let's try something else." The clones readied themselves for another go, but the monster was ready. It wound up for a punch and bam, one clone went flying. John rubbed his temples in frustration. How are we supposed to hunt this thing with these weak attacks? But then, an idea popped into his head. Wait a minute. I remember a bullet ricocheting off another one and causing some damage. What if we aim at the same spot and hit it with multiple shots? He couldn't contain his excitement. "Yes. That'll work," he shouted. He told the clones to fill the monster with bullets. The fishman wasn't happy about this and started attacking again. swinging wildly, all while being riddled with bullets. He grabbed his sword, and poof, it caught fire. The clone barely managed to block the fiery sword in time, but it wasn't enough. He got sent flying across the forest. "Okay, this monster just got a whole lot stronger," John muttered. The fishman tried to swing at another clone, but the clone dodged. John scratched his head, trying to figure out what was going on. The sword's on fire. Maybe the monster's just temporarily evolved to protect itself because it's really hurt? He watched as the clone tried to attack again, but the fishman landed a hit. The clone grabbed the monster's hand in desperation, trying to hold on, and began launching attacks everywhere he could, but the fishman wasn't having it. He prepared another strike with his other hand. The clone managed to block it, but not without getting hurt. He separated from the fishman and moved in for another attack. The fishman noticed and prepared to strike again. He went for a kick, and boom, it landed squarely. The clone crouched, gritting his teeth, trying to bear the pain. But the fishman wasn't letting up and attacked again. Just as things were looking grim, the other clone, who had been knocked earlier, came charging back in and saved him. Together, they attacked the fishman again. The monster, clearly running low on energy, glared at them in frustration. With one last defiant look, the fishman collapsed to the ground, defeated. John sighed in relief. It's over. Finally. The clones, exhausted, flopped to the ground to rest. John nodded to himself. We're out of bullets, anyway. It's time to call it a day. He made a mental note to update Agent Genmo on the situation, but just as he was about to turn around, one of the clones spotted something. Footprints. John's heart sank. Wait, the monster's not dead. Number 2, follow those tracks. The monster was heading toward the portal. At the entrance of the hunting field, a guard was blocking other hunters from entering, explaining that there was a ranked monster in the area. He told them that association hunters would soon be dispatched and that he would provide updates as soon as there was any news. Meanwhile, Agent Genmo was starting to get antsy, wondering why John wasn't there yet. Suddenly, the guard shouted for everyone to gather their forces and inform the chief. The monster, still alive, was charging toward the entrance, preparing to attack anyone in its path. The guards tried to stop the fishman, but it was futile. Finally, the monster reached the portal, and just as it was about to burst through, Number 1 popped out of a bush and threw a dagger at it. The dagger bounced off like it was nothing. But just then, John appeared out of nowhere, catching the dagger mid-air. He prepared to use all his strength, determined to finish this once and for all. With incredible agility, John launched himself at the fishman, ready to end the threat before it could hurt anyone else. Even one of his own clones was taken aback by his sudden speed. Just then, someone announced that they had arrived on the scene. "We'll report the details after the investigation," the agent said, although, standing over the fallen fishman, he had no idea what to report. When he finally got a good look, his jaw dropped. "A fishman? Seriously?" one of the guards asked. "Are you from the association?" The guard got straight to the point. "What's going on here?" He explained that a hunter had been inside the portal before it got blocked off and was hunting a rank D monster. But here's the kicker, this was a rank D monster at the field level, which meant a whole rank D team should have been on the job. But nope, it was just one hunter, not a team. Blinked in disbelief. One hunter? And to top it off, this guy had Class F clones helping him out? Ed couldn't wrap his head around it. How in the world did a Class F hunter and his clones take down a rank D monster? Then he noticed something else. Every attack had been concentrated on one spot. He figured that was because they didn't have any special weapons. But still, how did they land those hits with such precision on a moving monster? While the guard was still rattling on, and casually glanced over at the kid talking to his agent. He cut the guard off, telling him to finish the investigation while he went back to focusing on other things. The rank D monster was on the ground. He was already thinking about how he'd report this to the association. If he claimed he took down the monster on his own, they'd probably think he was lying. Meanwhile, John's skills were leveling up like crazy. He was unlocking abilities left and right. But then he thought about the clones, number 1 and number 2. They survived mostly because of their regeneration abilities. The agent asked, "How are the clones doing?" John explained that they were injured but still had some recovery time ahead of them. Then the agent praised him for taking down the rank D monster solo. John just shrugged and said, "Hey, I wasn't joking. I really thought I could do it on my own." That's when John remembered the short sword. The monster had it, and it was unique. He mentioned how the monster had changed once its eyes turned red. It became something else entirely. The agent looked wary. "I wouldn't touch that sword if I were you," he said. "It might be cursed." John wasn't thrilled with that idea. If the sword was cursed, it would be useless to him, but then the agent added, "Still, it could be worth a lot since it's cursed." John's eyes brightened a little. Well, if it was valuable, maybe it was worth a risk. He decided he'd let one of the clones deal with it first. Then he remembered another item, the thing that had fallen from the fishman's head. "Is this rare too?" he asked, pulling out what looked like a red stone. The agent took a look and immediately let the air out of John's excitement. That's just a low-level gem. It's basically worthless." John's face fell. He had been hoping to make a small fortune from that little stone. Seeing his disappointment, the agent tried to cheer him up. "Hey, the other items might be worth more, so don't feel too bad." That helped a bit. John asked the agent to take care of the rest of the loot while he went back home. He was pretty tired after everything that had happened, but before crashing, he had to summon number 3. With a little concentration, he got number 3 to show up again and handed him some gear for a workout. John took off his dirty clothes from the hunt and took a nice, refreshing shower. Then, it was time to check out the sword. He stared at it in the box. It was beautiful, probably the most beautiful short sword he'd ever seen. And it was his. He felt pretty proud of that. But then he took a closer look at the stone. It looked like a strength gem. His research confirmed it was a low-level crystal with a strength attribute. But there was a catch: it had a side effect. It could turn him into a monster. A monster? John shuddered at the thought. Usually, the clones would be the ones affected by things like that, but what if this time it was him? What if he became a monster, and no one recognized him? The agent might try to hunt him down like prey. Nope, not using this gem, he decided. Next up, the sword. He remembered the agent's warning, don't touch it directly. So, he kept it safely inside its box. He asked number 2 to take it out, but when number 2 grabbed the sword, he froze. He looked weird. John got a little nervous. "What's going on?" he asked. Number 2 looked up and said, I hear a voice. It's coming from the sword." John's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't hear anything, so he activated his familiar ability to listen in. Suddenly, a jumble of voices flooded his mind, all talking at once. It was like 1,000 whispers all competing for attention. John quickly turned off the ability. "Okay, nope. We're not dealing with that right now." He had a feeling this sword was far more than it seemed. So, apparently, the noise from the sword didn't bother the clone too much, other than being really loud. Yeno, not one to miss a chance, decided to give the sword a go. When he checked the status windows, he saw that regeneration was going up, so that was a win. He glanced at clones number 1 and 2 and realized they were actually resting and recovering. Still, they'd need to hunt again the next day, and they weren't in tip-top shape. He told them they'd meditate together for now and work on unlocking some mana-breeding stuff. Right after that, he activated the meditation function. The next day, Yeno was back at college. It was kind of a shock for him. Where did the semester go? It felt like it just zoomed past while he was busy raising his stats. He hadn't even noticed time flying by. Anyway, he was back in class, but something felt off. It was lonely. Nobody seemed to recognize him. He walked into the room, and, finally he saw a familiar face. It was the guy from the gym the other day. Turns out, the guy joined because he'd heard a rumor that one of the professors was super generous with grades. The guy asked if Yeno was still keeping up with his usual routine. Little by little, people started to recognize him. It was like they were slowly realizing, wait, is that young Sangun? He had changed so much, he was almost unrecognizable. His gym buddy went on about how Yeno was now super popular with the girls. Yeno couldn't even believe it himself. He didn't realize he'd changed that much. The guy next to him was like, dude, have you even been home to see your parents? Yeno was planning to head back to his place and stay for a while. When the friend invited him out for drinks, Yeno declined. He had other plans. The friend, convinced that Yeno was just making excuses, joked that he was probably sneaking off to meet a girl. But Yeno just had a promise to keep. The friend, now fully convinced, went on to tell everyone that Yeno was definitely a traitor, no more excuses, and definitely no hiding it. Meanwhile, in a completely different place, the staff of the World Hunters Association was getting some news. One of the staff members rushed to report to his superior. The Oracle had predicted a disaster. The superior, Mr. Michael Harris, the president of the association, asked for details. The staff member didn't waste any time. A portal's opening and an invasion of hundreds of monsters. And, oh yeah, the strongest of them would be rank A. Mr. Michael asked where and when this was happening. The staff member explained that while they didn't know exactly where or when, it was most likely going to happen in South Korea in the coming days. Back in Korea, a bunch of guild leaders were meeting. Most of them were confused about why such a big meeting had been called. A guild leader walked in looking for Mr. Wante, and bam! She bumped right into him. Mr. Wante, winded for a second, still managed to greet her. It was none other than Miss Mayo, master of the Yellow Guild, Han Miho. She was like, something big's going down, huh? Mr. Wante, master of the Kina's Guild, agreed. They kept chatting on their way to the meeting room. Inside the meeting room, there were a bunch of guild masters, but one of them, Mr. Shen Haesong, master of the Haesong Guild, was throwing some serious side-eye at Mr. Wante. It was pretty clear they didn't like each other. Mr. Shen, oozing arrogance, couldn't help but poke fun at Mr. Wante, and he just couldn't resist mentioning the Kina's Guild's most sensitive topic, the Odin Tower. He mocked Mr. Wante by bringing up the fact that Team 1 had recently been sent there. I haven't heard anything in the last few days. Wonder why? He taunted. Mr. Kim Il-jin, number 2 guild master in Korea, tried to shut Mr. Shen up, but he was having none of it. He kept pushing, saying, the results weren't good enough, were they? Tension in the room was skyrocketing. It looked like Mr. Wante was about to lose it. Then, bam, the door swung open. In walked Mr. Obianhun, leader of the Korean Hunters Association. He immediately noticed the heavy atmosphere and asked, what's going on here? Mr. Wante, clearly still mad, but trying to calm down, took his seat and started cooling off. The other guild masters took a deep breath and calmed down. Finally, peace in the room. Mr. Obianhun, the leader of the association, was looking pretty puzzled by the whole situation. He cleared his throat and started the meeting, thanking everyone for showing up. Then he dropped the bombshell. Korea had received a disaster alert from the World Hunters Association. Mr. Shen, with his usual curiosity and sarcasm, asked, is it the Oracle? To which Mr. Obianhun replied, well, actually, it's about a portal opening and a massive wave of monsters flooding in. And guess what? Some of those monsters are probably gonna be rank A. The room collectively cringed. We need everyone, every guild in Korea, to work together on this, Mr. Obianhun stressed. Of course, the guild masters had a bunch of questions. When is this happening? Where do we need to be? They wanted to cover the entire country and be ready for the monsters. That's why they were all gathered there, in fact. But Mr. Obianhun didn't have much to offer. He said, we know it's coming, but we have no exact details. And we're short on hunters for the job. Then came Park Wante, the leader of Kina's Guild, who was definitely going to make his mark. He had a proposal: when the disaster hits, all the guilds will gather at the location of the portal and throw all their resources at it, no exceptions. And any guilds that don't play along? Severe consequences. Everyone in the room listened carefully, then raised their hands one by one to show they agreed. The meeting was over, and they were all on board with Wante's plan. Mr. Obianhun wrapped things up, and just like that, the meeting ended. Meanwhile, Yeno, the young hunter, had just finished his first day back at school. He was pretty happy that it went by quickly. As he walked out, he saw the girl who was his student, chatting with some guy. The guy was really pushing for her phone number, but she kept saying she had a boyfriend. Not deterred, the guy kept trying to insist. Yeno strolled over and asked what was going on. The girl, calling him love, which instantly made Yeno cringe, told him she'd been waiting for him. They were heading out, and Yeno asked if the guy had been pressuring her. She shrugged and explained that she'd been saying she had a boyfriend just when Yeno showed up, but actually, she didn't. She also pointed out that Yeno couldn't stop staring at her casual clothes. Just then, Yeno's phone buzzed with a message, "All fees debited, balance payment deposited." He checked it and saw he'd earned 50 million. His clones were doing awesome. So, naturally, he decided to treat the girl to some expensive meat. They went for Korean beef, and she couldn't stop complimenting how delicious everything was. She was worried about the cost, though, and asked if he was sure he could afford it. He just shrugged and said, "You eat, I'm just apologizing." Then, he went full-on excited mode and ordered enough beef for 4 people. But before they could dig into the extra portions, alarms started going off everywhere. The phone started ringing, and it was on TV. This was not a drill. It was a disaster alert for the entire country. Everyone in the restaurant froze, staring at their screens. The authorities were telling everyone to check evacuation sites, and suddenly, there was a massive sense of worry in the air. Jono, one of Yeno's friends, was pretty upset. How is he out here eating beef while we're stuck in a disaster alert? One of the friends was a little skeptical, thinking it was just a casual hangout. But as soon as they saw Yeno and the girl enjoying themselves, the skepticism turned into betrayal. Just then, Yeno's friend's phone rang, and so did everyone else's, but even though his friend felt betrayed, he didn't check the messages. Yeno, however, quickly realized something big was going on across the country. He could feel the internet going wild. Then, he started noticing his friends. They were all there in the restaurant, too, clearly curious. His friends were giving him the side eye, wondering who the girl with him was. Yeno quickly tried to explain, "It's not like that. She's just my student." But it didn't seem to help much. After giving a quick explanation, Yeno introduced his friends to his student. Ji-young, being the responsible guy he is, or at least trying to be, asked for the leftover food to be packed up so the student could take it home to her parents. He also told his friends not to wander around too much because of the disaster alert. Naturally, they all rolled their eyes. "Ugh, this guy is such a grumpy old man," they all thought as they muttered under their breath. Yeno was so fed up that he nearly shouted at them to go home and stop bothering their parents, but instead, he just grumbled. The whole situation made him more uncomfortable than it should have. His friends weren't taking the warning seriously at all. They were just hanging out, eating beef, and laughing like it was just another day. He couldn't believe how normal everyone was acting. Maybe he was just overreacting. Or maybe not. Pulling out his phone, he called his agent. "Do you know about the disaster warning?" Yeno asked. "Anything more specific I should know?" His agent replied with the usual vague stuff, saying they wanted to stay in place for 3 months since they weren't sure when or where the portal would open. That info made Yeno mad. If it's that dangerous, why don't they give us more details and tell people to really be careful? He fumed. But the agent explained the real issue: the 3-month wait was going to have a massive economic impact. So, they weren't providing more details, just enough to cover themselves so they could say they warned people and avoid the financial mess. Yeno was heading to the shelter while all this was going down. When he arrived, he was anxious to check on number 1 and 2. The 2 clones were feeling a little better, but Yeno noticed they still weren't quite back to 100%. He glanced at their statuses and realized that number 3 wasn't ready to be summoned yet. So, he summoned number 1 again. When number 1 appeared, Yeno told him to wear a cap so no one would confuse him with the other clones. After a bit, all 4 of them were back together, and Yeno decided it was time to go home. When they arrived at his mother's house with food, she stood at the door and stared blankly. She didn't recognize him. His own mother couldn't even figure out it was him because he'd lost so much weight. Feeling awkward, Yeno told her, "Yeah, Mom, it's really me." She stared, stunned, saying, "What happened to you? Did you starve yourself?" Even his dad didn't seem to recognize him. Then his sister came to the door, ready to give him a hard time for not rushing to see her first. "Why are you standing there like that?" she asked, but then, when she looked closer, she was also shocked. Same surprised face as the parents. It was at that moment Yeno remembered what his friends had said. When he came home, Even his family wouldn't recognize him. His mom, still confused, asked why his friends were all wearing masks. Yeno sighed and explained, "They're not actually my friends, they're clones." His parents and sister stared at him in disbelief, trying to process the idea of clones. After some explanation, they finally understood. Apparently, his mom had heard that most young people practice some sort of abilities, but she didn't know he was practicing this kind. Yeno explained that he was working as a hunter. "A hunter? That's dangerous," his mother said. She was really upset. "With your ability, you don't need to put yourself in that kind of danger." She then brought up the disaster warning again and suggested they all head to the shelter. His dad, already packing, said, "We'll keep an eye on the situation, but we can't just drop everything and leave like that. I've got work tomorrow." Yeno looked at them, wondering how they didn't realize how serious the situation was. He thought to himself, "Well, at least I can warn them about the impending monster invasion." John said he would stick around at least for the day because he got a message saying that classes had been suspended. He knew that wouldn't exactly convince anyone to leave, so he figured, why not stay? Plus, dinner was calling. He gathered everyone around and asked his sister what she thought of the meal. She took one look at the packaging, and her eyes lit up. "Korean beef? Oh, wow, that's amazing." Looking at his parents, he realized he really should have visited them sooner. But then, he thought about the clones. He couldn't really give them the fancy Korean beef, could he? So, he just gave them rice. The three clones sat around a massive bowl of rice like it was the best thing they'd ever seen. After everything was set, he told everyone, "All right, we're all hungry, so let's eat." His sister glanced around and noticed there were now 4 people eating, and jokingly asked, "What happens if you get fat again?" His mom was overjoyed. It had been ages since they had a meal with the whole family together. John paused for a second, soaking in the warmth of the moment, looking at his parents and sister, feeling like everything was just perfect. But of course, the peace didn't last. Before he knew it, he was flat on the floor with some minor injuries, trying to figure out what on earth had happened. He looked around and was totally confused. His parents' house, and the entire area, had been hit by something. He looked up, and the sky was filled with creatures from another dimension. From the newly opened portal, monstrous A and B class monsters, the size of buildings, started stomping down on the city. These beasts were wreaking havoc, and the few hunters available couldn't control them. The city was done for. John stared in disbelief. His first instinct was to check on his family. He turned and saw them all on the ground, buried under debris. His heart sank. He spotted some equipment on the ground and realized that number 1 had shielded them from the explosion with his own body. To his side, he saw some movement. His clones, who had also taken the blast and were in rough shape. Number 1 was gone, and number 3 was injured. John's mother crawled out from the rubble, and he called to her. "Are you okay?" she asked, looking him over. "Yeah, I'm fine," he replied, though it didn't feel like it. His father, still in shock, was moaning about the house. John quickly reminded him, "The house doesn't matter right now. The portal has opened, and the city is basically gone." The streets outside were chaos. Monsters were running wild, hunting people. Some were being buried, while others weren't so lucky and were captured by the monsters. The portal kept spitting out creatures like there was no end to them. John quickly packed what little supplies they had into a backpack. "Did you get dressed?" he asked his sister. She nodded but grumbled, "It's a little big." "Yeah, number 1 won that," he joked. "Is he okay?" she asked, looking concerned. "He's fine," John assured her, though he wasn't entirely sure himself. Just then, something big hit the ground, causing a small explosion. It was a monster that had apparently fallen from the sky. John was about to laugh it off, thinking it was just an accident, but then another monster fell. And that's when it hit him. The portal was open in the sky, and all the monsters who couldn't fly were just falling out. "Well, at least we're lucky in that regard," he muttered, but the relief didn't last long. They tried to open the door to leave, but it wouldn't budge. His sister, a little panicked, asked him for help. His dad, also a little lost in the moment, suggested the door was broken. John grabbed a baton from his father's hand and said, "Hang on, I've got this." With all his focus, he activated his strike ability and hit the door with everything he had. The door locked up tighter than before, so he finished it off with a powerful kick that sent it flying open. "All right, let's go," he shouted. The view outside was horrifying. Monsters were everywhere, on the streets, in the cars, even on top of buildings. "How far is the nearest shelter?" John asked his dad, hoping for some good news. 2 kilometers, his dad replied. Not exactly comforting, especially when slimes were slithering around and skeletons were reassembling themselves after falling. Golems were getting back up and rebuilding. John muttered to himself, "There's no way we're going to make it through this." His sister, always the quick thinker, suggested they use the underground tunnels. John looked at her, wide-eyed. "You have tunnels at home?" He snapped back to reality and told everyone, "All right, we're going underground." But then, they heard someone calling for help. Someone was buried under a pile of rubble, begging for assistance. As John turned to see, the monster that had been knocked out was starting to wake up, using the debris to stand up. Looks like they weren't out of the woods yet. The trapped man, upon seeing the deranged troll, screamed in sheer terror. His panic was contagious, and he cried out for help again. John's father, already thinking ahead, was worried about what John might do next. He told John to think things through. "We can't save everyone, son. We need to head for the tunnels," he urged. John wasn't so sure. Number 3 couldn't really fight properly, and Number 2 was strong, but not enough to handle a giant troll on his own. Meanwhile, the trapped man kept yelling for someone to hear him. John glanced at the man and thought, "I can't just leave him there. He's not a clone. If he goes down, that's it. He needs help." His family asked him what he was doing. The trapped man even started calling out for his mother, which was a nice touch, but John wasn't about to let a guy get eaten by a troll just because it was convenient. "When you get to the tunnels, lock the door behind you and wait for me," he told them. He turned to Number 2, "Come with me." He looked at Number 3 and said, "You protect the family." His sister, clearly not a fan of this plan, shouted, "Are you crazy?" His dad asked, "You're really going to do this?" John nodded. "I'm a hunter. This is what I do," he said, and without further ado, he and Number 2 rushed out to try and help the trapped man. His sister yelled after him, "Come back." John knew this was one of those situations where monsters rained down from the sky and there was only one thing hunters had to do: fight. Without wasting another second, he charged at the troll and swung. It hit. The troll seemed affected, but not nearly enough. John, however, wasn't about to back down. He ordered Number 2 to get the man to safety. "I'm a hunter. It's my duty," he muttered to himself as he checked on the trapped man, asking if he could walk. The man gave a shaky nod, and Number 2 started clearing debris to get him out. As Number 2 worked, the troll, now clearly irritated by the situation, roared. John was getting annoyed too. "This thing is huge," he muttered, staring at the giant monster. He quickly told Number 2 to grab a weapon. "No time to be picky," John said, tossing a crystal at him. "Eat this." Without hesitation, Number 2 devoured the crystal, and John watched as the effects took hold. Number 2 started to transform. It was kind of like watching a superhero in training. John grinned as the transformation completed. "Still loyal?" he asked, and Number 2 confirmed he was. "Let's show this troll what we've got," John said, his confidence boosted by the transformation. The troll, clearly confused by what was going on, started charging at them, swinging its massive club and wrecking everything in its path. John dodged the first attack, and then the troll tried to grab him. But Number 2 was quick, moving to the side and hitting the troll's arm with a mighty swing. John couldn't help but admire how much stronger Number 2 had become. "This sword is amazing," he thought. The troll, now roaring in pain, became even angrier, launching a barrage of attacks with newfound rage. John easily dodged most of them. Despite the troll's size, it was slower than the fishman he had defeated in the dungeon, so John had a chance. He charged at the troll, attacking with all his might, but the giant monster managed to block most of the blows, only suffering a small wound on its hand. John stared in disbelief. The troll's arm, which had been severely damaged by Number 2, was already healing. "What kind of regeneration does this thing have?" John muttered as he took a hit, managing to defend just in time, though it sent him flying. The troll's regeneration was no joke. Its flesh wasn't particularly tough, but it healed so fast that it didn't really matter. John realized he couldn't rely on sheer strength alone. "All right, number 2, he called. "Knock it down." That's when he decided to go all in. He aimed for the troll's leg, hoping that would at least give him a chance to take it down. After a powerful hit, John could tell the troll was shaken. Even though it had the regeneration ability, it was starting to feel the pain. The troll, now enraged, stared John down. As it charged at him, John got ready. "This is it," he thought. "Time to finish this."
He fired bullets into the troll's eyes, hoping to visually impair it. The troll was teary at this point, from the intense pain.
He leaned back, gathering strength for one last strike. With everything he had, he hurled his attack at the troll, sending the massive beast flying across the battlefield. The troll crashed to the ground, and John's stats were boosted from the victory. His hand throbbed from the force of the strike, but it was a small price to pay for saving the day. John was still catching his breath after the fight with the troll, reflecting on how the creature was just as strong as the fishmen he'd fought before, except this time, the troll didn't even have a decent weapon. "Man, that thing was a beast," John muttered to himself. But then, his focus shifted to his sister. "I need to get to her. She's not safe," he thought. He started thinking about calling her, but then remembered he'd lost his phone during the fight. "Great," he sighed, then turned to his clone. "Hey, can you give me your phone?" Without hesitation, Clone 2 handed over his device. John gave him a wry smile. "You know, with that new look of yours, you might get kicked out of the shelter. They don't take kindly to whatever you've turned into." Clone 2 just stared back, unbothered. Just as John was about to call his sister, they both heard a strange noise. It was a stampede of monsters chasing after a group of surviving citizens. John frowned. Of course, this would happen right now. The city, which had already been devastated by the invasion, was getting worse by the minute. Overhead, airplanes were circling the ruins, observing the apocalyptic scene from above. The monsters were rampaging, with colossal creatures stomping on buildings. One massive draconic beast was preparing to fire a destructive beam of flame. But before it could unleash its fiery destruction, a spell from a fire mage intercepted the beam mid-air. John glanced up at the sky, where members of the Red Fire Guild, ranked 9th in Korea, had just arrived. But they weren't alone. The Scorpion Guild, ranked 7th in Korea, had also shown up. The draconic monster roared, enraged by the attack. The guild members didn't hesitate, they immediately launched their assault on the beast. Meanwhile, planes with more hunters circled the area, preparing to jump into the fray. "Time to go," the pilot said as the hatch opened, revealing more lead hunters ready for action. A flying monster dove toward the aircraft, but the defense weapons were already up, blasting the creature out of the sky. "We can't afford to waste resources," someone from the team said. "We need to prioritize the evacuation of survivors." Below them, both strong and weak monsters were scattered throughout the city, and some hunters were even looting, or worse, robbing unconscious survivors. The commander, watching the scene unfold, was furious. "Disgusting," he muttered. Just then, the pilot pointed out a group of survivors 700 meters away. The commander activated a power in his eyes, zooming in on the group. He spotted Zhang and his clone, defending a family. "Looks like he's holding his own," the commander thought. But he quickly realized the situation was dire. The number of enemies was far too large for just 2 people to handle. "Pilot, head north. I'm suiting up." He put on his gear, told his team to regroup, and then jumped out of the aircraft, activating his flight gear to head straight toward Zhang. Meanwhile, Zhang, still battling monsters, thought to himself, "Just get rid of the troll, then head to the tunnels." But the monsters kept coming. The family he was protecting was trembling with fear. Zhang urged them to head to the basement of the building for safety, but one of them pointed out there were monsters behind them. Zhang turned to Clone 2 and said, "Cover the rear, I'll handle the front." A monster was about to attack one of the family members, but Clone 2 was quick to strike first. Zhang, wielding his weapon, managed to keep the monsters at bay, but he was quickly running out of energy. "No more strike ability," he thought. That takes too much juice. Then, out of nowhere, debris shifted, and a giant bird monster emerged. Not again. Zhang groaned, narrowly dodging the bird's attack. The bird had this weird, glowing power that looked almost like lava. It nearly hit Zhang, but he managed to block it. Some of it splashed toward the defenseless family, but Clone 2 leapt in front of them, taking the full brunt of the attack. He was seriously injured. Zhang, unable to stand, leaned on his staff, exhausted. Just when things seemed at their worst, a giant paw appeared out of nowhere and crushed the bird monster. Zhang, stunned, looked up to see a giant tiger monster standing in front of him. His strength drained away as he watched, powerless. The weaker monsters, sensing the danger, fled in fear, but number 2 had taken too much damage and vanished from the fight. The tiger was now focused on Zhang, who was sitting on the ground, defeated, just waiting for the end. But then, a slash came from nowhere, striking the tiger and causing it to stumble. Zhang opened one eye, still waiting for his inevitable doom. To his surprise, he saw a hunter he didn't recognize standing in front of the tiger. The slash had sliced the tiger in half, and the monster roared in pain. The people watching couldn't believe their eyes. "Who is that guy?" they whispered, completely stunned by the hunter's strength. Zhang could only stare in disbelief at the stranger who had just saved him. The hunter took off his mask and asked if Zhang was okay. Zhang, still in shock, managed to ask, Who are you?" The hunter smiled and introduced himself. "I'm Park, from the Keenest Guild. You know, the one that runs the buildings underground." A voice rang out from behind them, shouting to be let out. It was Hai Wu, demanding that number 3 release her so she could go save her brother. Looking at number 3, she couldn't help but wonder why he was so strong. Shouldn't a clone want to save the original? She asked, a little confused. Number 3 replied without hesitation, "I prioritize the master's orders." Her parents, sensing the growing tension, told Hai Wu to calm down. "You're scaring everyone," her dad said gently. Hai Wu, still anxious, asked her father, "Aren't you worried?" He nodded but reassured her, "Zhang will return. That clone of his is just a reflection of his power. If the clone's fine, then Zhang's fine." When Hai Wu saw Zhang break down the door, her father's words seemed to sink in. "Trust your brother," he added. Hai Wu nodded, though she felt a lump in her throat. "I'll believe in him," she said, and with that, number 3 relaxed his grip. Just as the tension seemed to ease, they heard a noise at the door. Someone was asking for help. Hai Wu asked if it could be Zhang, but her father shook his head. "No, the voice is different." They all gathered around to see what was going on. Through the security camera, they saw a man standing outside. The mother speculated, could it be the guy Zhang saved? Hai Wu, determined to help, said she was going to open the door. As she opened the door, she thought she might see Zhang standing there, but instead, the man in front of her was suddenly grabbed by a giant monster's paw. Hai Wu froze in shock as the man was flung aside like a rag doll. The monster let out a chilling laugh. It was a rank B monster, the screaming firefly. The shelter's atmosphere shifted immediately as everyone realized the danger. Number 3 quickly moved to defend the group, standing in front of Hai Wu to shield her. She stood there paralyzed with fear, staring up at the enormous insect creature. As number 3 took the full force of the monster's attack, Hai Wu could only watch in horror, but it wasn't enough to keep her completely safe.
The creature managed to pierce her also.
The parents reacted immediately, but it was Hai Wu's instinct that kicked in next.
Number 3 with an instinctive reflex fired at the door's electronic lock, which triggered an emergency lockdown.
The system, sensing damage, engaged the emergency lock. But the monster, not deterred, tried to force its way inside. Number 3, with all his remaining strength, grabbed the creature and pushed it outside. He was right there with it, throwing himself into the fight. Meanwhile, Hunter Park, who was the man who had organized the Awakening program, was the same person who had been fighting these monsters. He introduced himself to John. "I'm Park, and I'm glad I could help you." John, still a bit dazed, thanked him. "I'm John Sang-woon. Thanks for saving me." But Park was more impressed with John than he let on. "You've saved so many lives. You didn't run when you could have." "That takes guts," he said, genuinely amazed. John, a little embarrassed, replied, "Well, I couldn't just leave everyone here. Too many people rely on each other." Park nodded thoughtfully. "It's not easy to keep a human's will strong in a situation like that. What you did. That's real bravery." John blushed, not used to receiving such praise. As they spoke, Park's mind wandered. He remembered sensing something strange in the air while flying. Fighting that mysterious being hadn't been easy, especially with all the people to save. It was something he couldn't quite put his finger on, a presence that vanished into thin air, leaving behind only its clothes. Before disappearing, it had fought a monster many times its size. What were those new monsters? Park thought. Turning back to John, who was finally getting back on his feet, Park asked, "Hey, are you a hunter?" John nodded, though with a hint of hesitation. "I am. But probably not for long." Park raised an eyebrow. "Mind if I ask about your ability?" John, grateful to the hunter who had saved his life, was about to explain his ability when he suddenly froze. His connection with number 3 was gone. Panic set in. Grabbing his sword, he shouted, "My family's in danger," and dashed off. Hunter Park yelled after him, "Don't go alone, it's too dangerous." But John had already called for reinforcements and tracking before he bolted. As he sprinted home, his mind raced. The portal wasn't fully closed, and he couldn't shake the ominous whispers coming from the sword. Activating his dash ability, he pushed himself to the limit, but something strange was happening. The sword wasn't just guiding him, it was changing him. Elsewhere, another hunter unleashed a fiery blast that engulfed the area in flames. His attack was so massive it needed support teams to handle the fallout. Unfortunately, the monsters kept coming, each one tougher than the last. Poison attacks didn't work, and the hunters were struggling. Amid the chaos, Shenheism showed up, smirking. "Heard there's money to be made," he said, cryptically, ignoring the team's confusion. He wasn't interested in teamwork, he wanted to face the supreme monster and flaunt his overwhelming power. Back at Haiwu's family, chaos reigned. Her father was frantic as he wrapped her injuries, while her mother sobbed and grabbed more bandages. The monster that had attacked them earlier was back, pounding on the door. Fear rippled through the shelter, but Haiwu, injured and weak, begged them to hurry. The parents couldn't bear the thought of leaving her behind, but they were paralyzed with worry. Suddenly, the door burst open, and John stormed in, sword in hand, looking nothing like the boy they knew. His expression was dark, and an unsettling aura surrounded him. Everyone froze, even his father, who noticed something was off. But John only saw his injured sister, his terrified parents, and the monster that caused it all. Rage boiled over, and the sword seemed to feed on it. John and the monster locked eyes, then charged at each other. Their clash left both injured, but John, consumed by fury, didn't even feel his wounds. The monster taunted him, mimicking his sister's voice, which only fueled his rage. The sword demanded blood, and John obliged, charging again. Just as the monster's attack was about to land, someone leapt in front of John and yanked him to safety. Hunter Park and another hunter had arrived. Their presence made the monster hesitate, retreating slightly. A huntress quickly shielded John, satisfied that her timing was perfect. Meanwhile, Park landed a devastating blow on the monster, sending it flying. The huntress turned to John, now trembling under the sword's influence. He was lost in a berserk state, driven by hallucinations and bloodlust. She activated her mental transfer ability, trying to calm him down. "Rest, just for a moment," she said gently. But despite her efforts, John remained trapped in the sword's grip, his mind too clouded to respond. The battle wasn't over, and neither was John's fight with himself. When asked about the boy's condition, the huntress bluntly said, "We need to take down the monster, fast." Despite his injuries, the young hunter insisted on speaking. She tried to stop him, warning his wounds might reopen, but he managed to croak, "My sister. She's hurt." Clutching his chest, it was clear his emotional pain outweighed the physical. Summoning what strength he had, he begged them, "Please. Save her." Hunter Park's energy skyrocketed at those words. Turning to the monster, he declared, "Neither you nor his sister will die today." The monster, sensing Park's growing intensity, hesitated. Park reassured the boy, "Rest now. This ends soon." Meanwhile, Obianthan was scrambling to organize an evacuation. He shuffled through meeting papers when someone barged in, demanding his attention. "The #1 guild master needs a word," the man growled, exuding arrogance. Annoyed but intrigued, Obianthan waved him in. The guild leader advised evacuating people quietly, without mentioning the A-class monster wreaking havoc. "If you announce it, panic will destroy your reputation before the monster does," he warned. Shin Haesung, ever the opportunist, suggested, "If things get bad, hunters will look even more heroic. People love a good rescue story." The guild leader placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "This isn't a suggestion," he said, his voice icy. Obianthan left fuming, muttering about how many lives were at risk. While all this drama unfolded, the Megalosaurus Guild was fighting monsters, with clones doing most of the heavy lifting. Pleased with his efficient workout strategy, casually fielded a call from Mr. Genmo. "Send the clones to the horned rabbit hunting ground. Let them train harder," Genmo suggested. But when asked why the young hunter wasn't training too, the leader shrugged. "The clones can handle the grind. Why break a sweat when I'm doing fine hunting rabbits?" Genmo was unimpressed. "And that attitude is why things are falling apart," he snapped. Just then, the hunter noticed something strange. The people around him weren't acting right. His sister appeared, pleading, "Save me," but something was off. Suddenly, he was under attack. Confused and overwhelmed, he looked around desperately, only to jolt awake in a hospital bed. John gasped, disoriented, as Mr. Wundy greeted him. "Rough dream?" Wundy asked. "Don't move too much, you'll tear your stitches." John, too weak to argue, thanked him for saving his life.
Pak Wante
Waved it off. "We'll talk later," he said, his tone serious. "Now's not the time." John's parents burst into the room, worry etched all over their faces. John, surprised, greeted them with a weak smile. The doctor chimed in, "Good news. The surgery was a success. With a month of recovery, you'll be back to your usual self." John, still groggy, asked, "What happened with the portal? How long has it been since the invasion?" His mom answered, 4 days. The big guilds handled the major monsters, but there are still some pests running around. John couldn't recall much before passing out but soon realized something was missing: his sister. Panic set in. "Where's Jai? Why isn't anyone saying anything?" The doctor finally spoke, explaining Jai's situation. "She was wounded and infected by a rare mana-absorbing virus. It's usually harmless," he said, "but in her case, it's fused with her mana. Neither medicine nor healing magic can fix it. The only hope? An S-class healer or an insanely expensive rare medicine." John sat in silence, his mind spiraling. Regret hit like a ton of bricks. Why didn't I prioritize my family? Memories of Jai begging him to go to the shelter played on repeat, fueling his frustration. His fists clenched so tightly his wounds reopened. "Stop that!" the doctor scolded. But John couldn't. The guilt, the anger, it was all consuming. Later, he woke up in the afternoon, drained and despondent. Quietly, someone entered the room. It was Hyun, his students. "Professor," she said softly, apologizing for the unannounced visit. John managed a small smile and asked about her family. She explained that while her house was damaged, they all made it to the shelter safely. When John asked how she found him, she mentioned her father contacting his. Their conversation shifted, and John broke the news: he was quitting his teaching job. Hyun, shocked, tried to play it cool. "Well, it's not like we'll lose touch," she said. "But you'll regret quitting on a student as pretty as me. I'll get into college, find a boyfriend, and then you'll be jealous." John chuckled weakly but didn't give her words much thought. He was too consumed by everything else. 2 weeks later, the doctor marveled at John's quick recovery. "Unbelievable," he exclaimed. "You're completely healed." John dressed casually, the scar on his shoulder a permanent reminder of the battle and his sister's condition. As he left the hospital, he thought about Hyun's teasing, his sister's plight, and the weight of the world on his shoulders. Regret? There wasn't time for that anymore. With one last glance at the hospital, he stepped out, ready, or maybe just resigned, For what came next, John flagged down a taxi to meet Mr. One Day. He stared at the imposing Keenest Guild office ahead and made his way inside. The receptionist greeted him with a plastic smile and asked if he had an appointment. When he admitted he didn't, she started to dismiss him, but a man nearby intervened. "Are you Mr. John?" the man asked. John nodded, and the man smiled. "Captain Wante is expecting you. Follow me." Upstairs, someone called out to Park Wante, letting him know John had arrived. Inside, Wante greeted him warmly. "You're out of the hospital already? That's impressive." John thanked him for everything, saving his family, securing private rooms, and arranging ICU care for his sister. But his curiosity got the better of him. "Why did you do all that for us?" Wante clenched his fists before answering. "I have a sister too. She's missing with her team in a dungeon. Maybe I saw myself in you. I didn't do it to make you feel obligated, though." John, puzzled, asked why he was called in so soon after his recovery. Wante cut to the chase. "About your clones, they're real and can actually do things, right?" John confirmed, and Wante silently celebrated being right. "I need your help," Wante said bluntly. "The Keenest Guild's first team, including my sister, is trapped in a dungeon. You're the only one who can save them." He lowered his head and added, "I'm begging you." John thought about it, remembering how Wante had saved his family. "You've helped me. I'll help you," he said. "Tell me what I need to do." They moved to the guild's training field. Wante explained, "We've got time. My sister's ability can sustain the team for 8 months. But the dungeon is an S rank. It's too dangerous as you are now." He added that extreme pressure brings out hidden strength but at a physical cost. "You'll need to push your stats to the limit. I'm sorry, but it's the only way." Later, at the jam agency, the agent sat biting his nails nervously while staring at his phone. When he heard footsteps, he turned around to see John, bruised and battered, walk in. "John? What happened to you?" John shrugged. "A lot. I've been busy. The Keenest Guild saved my family, so I'm helping save theirs." Woon asked why he'd been out of touch, and John explained he lost his phone and was using a backup. "It's better this way," he muttered. When Woon pressed him about the injuries, John admitted it was from training. "I need more stats for the mission. So yeah, I got my butt kicked today." Woon looked outraged. "They overdid it. I'm going to complain to the guild." John waved him off. "Relax. I agreed to this. Wante's sister is stuck in a dungeon, and he's desperate. I get it." As they talked, John mentioned his plan to use clones in the next training session. Woon sighed, "I'll grab some healing potions from the office. You're going to need them." The next day, at the training field, John thanked Wante for the training session. Determined, he announced, "Today's going to be different." He brought out a clone to help him train, but by the end of the session, both he and the clone were wrapped in bandages. The following day, John showed up with 2 clones. By the end, the trio left, all bandaged up like mummies. On the 3rd day, John brought 3 clones, but the result was the same. All 4 limped into John Moon's office, who asked, "Are you guys okay?" John, frustrated, realized that while his clones could learn moves instantly by watching, their stats were still miles behind. He needed a way to bridge the gap. Deep in thought, and covered in bandages, he had an idea. He approached Genlo with it. "Is this possible?" he asked. Genlo hesitated but replied, "It's risky, but yes." Back at the training field, Wante noticed John's determination and was shocked to see 3 transformed clones alongside him. Just then, an agent arrived with a box, saying, "Here's what you asked for." Inside were red gems. John explained to Wante that the clones, as semi-creatures, could absorb the gems to boost their stats. Wante was stunned. "You're telling me clones can use these?" John nodded and declared that today was the day to test their new power. With swords in hand, John and his clones surrounded Wante. Their moves were sharper, their strength noticeable, thanks to the gem boost. But Wante was still leagues ahead, countering their attacks with ease. Even a shot fired at him barely made a dent. "You can't rely on brute force alone," Wante said, effortlessly knocking all 4 down. "Pour mana into your sword and your arms. Make them one. When you master that, You'll be able to cut through monsters with just a tree branch. John took the advice to heart, noticing his wooden sword now felt stronger than steel. Despite being repeatedly knocked down, he refused to give up. Looking into Wante's eyes, he declared, "I'm not stopping at rank S." To motivate his clones, John yelled, "Look at him. That angular nose, those sharp features, he's a gem. Bite him." The clones hesitated, then began to see one day as a literal gem and lunged at him. John turned to Wante and admitted, "This isn't just about your request. When I woke up in that hospital, I felt powerless. My family's lives were in someone else's hands, and I hated it. I'll never feel that weak again." He launched himself at Wante one more time, clones following his lead. Even though they were bruised and battered, John stood tall, ready to keep fighting. "I'm not stopping," he declared. "Not until I'm stronger than anyone."
Please do channel my Sakrapara. Sakrapara. Sakrapais.